Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here too. I know that you grew up, Graham, in Guelph and in a Presbyterian church to start with. Tell us about how you ended up back in Guelph after years in London.
Yeah, so having grown up and had that wonderful experience at Courtright and Westminster St. Paul's Presbyterian here at Western, at London, and it was in the UK where I saw the church coming alive in a way that I had never really experienced before. I saw churches full of young people. I saw many, not just one or two kind of young ministers getting involved. And I just caught the bug. I don't know whether it was the Lord found me or I found him as an adult, but there was a real moment of experiencing an adult faith through the Alpha course and being very excited to see new churches reopened out of old ones. Yeah, we did begin to use the church planting term in many different cases. In some cases, these were brand new communities in brand new settings. So greenfield sites where we would see new churches grow. In the same way as, many Presbyterian churches in Canada were formed around new populations. Certainly many of the Victorian buildings or buildings in the kind of Victorian-based architecture like where we are here. But what we began to see were churches that needed to be reopened. Churches that were, really located in excellent areas, in central urban areas, but we had no models to actually get them going again. So the connection between Alpha and church planting grew. We found that people were traveling from quite far around cities to come to large city center churches like HTB. So eventually we'd say, look, why don't you stop traveling an hour to get to church? There's actually 50 of you that are coming to this church, and there's an empty building in your neighborhood. So why don't we begin to train some new clergy and send them out with you, and we'll reopen that building in this same kind of style. And in total, over the past 15 or so years, we've seen around 45 churches like that reopened in the London area.
Now, the Presbyterian Church in Canada is I'd say, catching up with where the Church of England was at 20 years ago, let's say. An article was published recently in MacLeod's that said that heaven help the poor Presbyterians, because we've seen with immigration a lot of Catholics arrive in Canada. We've also seen Protestants, but Presbyterians, this article suggested, rely more on their Scottish brethren. And there's not a lot of Scottish immigration going on. With church planting, you don't need to rely on the group of people that, in theory, are your group of people, right? So tell me how that works. How does a church plant help a congregation or a denomination reach out beyond its normal catchment area?
You and I have enjoyed speaking about this before, the idea of social infrastructure, and the idea that a church of any denomination, when based in a local community, actually begins to set down roots, almost like a system of plumbing or electrical wires or roads. So a denomination which has been present in a community actually tends to be known as a Christian presence more than of its particular denomination. And I think that gives an exciting opportunity. If we were to just say the Presbyterian Church of Canada is an extension of a Scottish style of worship into the Canadian nation, I don't think anybody would be particularly convinced about the future of that. The idea of saying the Presbyterian Church of Canada has an important presence for the gospel in all kinds of communities, and we need to look, as a phrase I could lend you from the Church of England, to proclaim the gospel afresh into every generation. And I think many mainline churches are looking at those same traditions. There's a Roman liturgical tradition, an English tradition, a Lutheran, a German tradition, Mennonites. None of those are really trying to say, we're trying to bring European culture afresh into Canada, or European church culture, which is totally unproven. If we look at Europe now, those are not what those churches in their founding roots are continuing to do now. Mm-hmm. But if we look and say what could be done now with the assets of community trust that we have, I think that's absolutely huge. The idea of putting out a banner saying, come to our church, come and hear the story of who Jesus is. The trust we have the opportunities we have, I think we're facing greenfield opportunities.
It's interesting. I just had lunch with the Embroiderers, a group that meets every week in my congregation, Courtright Church. And I sat next to a woman who is a member of a Presbyterian church in Etobicoke. Graceview is the name of it. And she was saying that her congregation is the product of at least 2 recent amalgamations. So 3 congregations have amalgamated and now are one. And she was saying it's mostly older people in spite of that pooling of strength. And in a way, what you're suggesting Holy Trinity Brompton has done, and we're seeing this in Canada now, a little bit anyway, is the opposite. It's what a congregation might think of as counterintuitive, because you're sharing from your strength as opposed to bringing people in, you're sending people out. Now, how do you convince people to do that?
I think aiming at younger people who are in a stage of life where they're exploring their faith, and they're doing so in a way that they want to change the world. They want to see the world become a better place, not only for themselves and their families, but for many others who are less fortunate. When we create a church culture that often gives the sense that, hey, we're not sure we're winning here, I think a lot of young people are asking those questions of faith, as well as asking the question of, could we possibly win in the culture, in our community? And the converse is also true. If we can give a sense that we're winning, and maybe celebrate the things, even the small things, and just celebrate a lot more, and say, hey, look at all these children, look at all these ideas, even if they all bomb or they don't work the way we thought, just the belief that actually we could make a difference, I think attracts in a lot of younger people. So in the sense that we could give away even before we've started, in some ways it's crazy to think, well, why should we think that way when we haven't even gotten this church started? But I would say it's actually in that desire to give away that many younger people are actually attracted in. I think it also helps us get around some of the church disagreements and debates that are important, but they're not as important as seeing vibrant churches started. I think there's some arguments we can move around and focus on things like Alpha to say, what are the basics? What's the point of doing church in any case?
I've heard it said that when a team goes out from one congregation, again, as Holy Trinity Brompton has done in London, into a church that's struggling, and my favorite example of this is in Toronto, where Little Trinity Anglican Church sent a group of, I think, 50 leaders, along with their associate minister, to Church of the Resurrection, which ironically was dying, and they saw this renewal take place where I think it's been 15 years now. It's a vital church of 300 people. Does something happen with that group that goes out where they're empowered, and then the gap that they leave behind, which a church might really worry about, we're giving away some of our best and brightest, our most committed people, I gather that often that gap is filled by people. People step into those empty places. And how does that work? What's that dynamic?
I'll give you an example of a friend I sent to a church that accepted dogs. And our church at the time didn't accept dogs. And I thought that it'd be wonderful for her to go to this church that did accept dogs. She went to sit down in the church, and somebody tapped her on the shoulder shortly after arriving. And she said, hello, you're in my seat. And I think sometimes with leadership in the churches, we haven't created enough spaces for people, not just a seat to sit down, but a seat to lead, a seat to try things out. And by giving away people and creating those empty spaces, we now all of a sudden have to scurry around and say, hey, could you lead the children's church? Could you get the worship going? Could you help us run an Alpha course? Now, I don't mean to be overly simplistic. I know there are many churches really struggling to do the absolute most basic things. And by no means am I suggesting that every church can at this point become a church planting church. By no means. But certainly what you're saying, with churches that have got some health, like Duke Vipperman's church in Toronto, the Resurrection, the Res as they call it, not only do the sending team get fired up, but those left behind have to step back in. I'll give you a typical kind of conversation here. If we're talking about including everybody as a church planter, We're saying, hey guys, we're all here as a new team, which means we've all got to find something to do. So if you're here, you're going to get a job. And that's what's going to make you a church planter. If you don't want to have a job here, this might not be the best time for you to be part of this church plant. And do you know how many people I find leave after that little speech? Kind of none. Because everybody does want to be involved.
Yeah.
But somehow when things get a bit staid, for whatever reason, you get that 80-20 rule. 20% of the people doing 80% of the work.
Right.
Church planting hopefully can refresh that.
So the term missional has been around now for about 20 years. I think it's nothing new. And yet there are still people in mainline Protestant circles that are hearing it for the first time. The idea that for ages we have expected people to come to us. We've been attractional churches and congregations. We try to grow our church by doing music better, having more programs, whatever it is that's our strength. We flex those muscles. Missional, on the other hand, is sending people out to meet those in their city, in their community, in their neighborhood, where they're at, instead of expecting them to come to us. We've talked about Glenn Soderholm's church plant here in Guelph, Two Rivers, and it strikes me that he doesn't have a building. He's got a community that meets in his home currently. I think they've grown to the point now where they're going to need to meet in a couple of homes. But the Holy Trinity Brompton church planting model is pretty building-centric in a way. Like you go into a building. Does that hold it back? I mean, it doesn't seem as cutting edge as some of the home churches and some of these different models we've heard about.
I think probably there's one significant thing that we discovered missionally about church in large cities, particularly church amongst young people. We found that they were asking far deeper questions than older people. So even as you reach your 30s, 40s, start having children, the level of questioning decreases dramatically. People in their early 20s, they're not interested in the kind of stand up, sit down, here's the way we behave in this church kind of approach. They may want to come back to having a sense of religion, a sense of discipline in their lives. But before they get there, they've got a lot of questions. So the idea of creating a large environment for questions and making that in some ways almost more important than the Sunday celebration was a big missional decision that still became quite attractional. So we could have run alpha courses in homes, and actually that does happen all around the world. But eventually as it grows, you start to say, well, boy, we're already putting on all this meal and all the rest of it. Wouldn't it be easier if we just do this in a larger kind of setting? But keeping that missional, incarnational impulse, the idea of going out to where people are at. In that case, I'm talking about people asking questions. In other places, in other situations, it's impossible to share the gospel when people have got literally no food, no clothing, no heating in their homes. And so there's very good missional reasons to go out and help with those aspects, as well as then have an opportunity to share the gospel into that. So I don't think that the missional movement in any way writes off what we could see as the more attractional churches. My shorthand is buildings with steeples. But bringing more missionally minded people back into the church, really listening to them, I think has a huge opportunity. I'll give you an example from my previous work in advertising. When we were working in a commercial sector, working segmenting customer markets for, let's say, a telephone company, we would take examples of real people and make real life-size cardboard cutouts of them and put them in the room where we were talking about what we were going to do. In the case of the church, sometimes I think we put people who look like us, who talk like us, who know church like us, and those are the people for whom we make all of our decisions. The idea of bringing missional into an attractional model is being very open to the different people who live in our neighborhood and completely rethinking church around them first, over and above some of the traditions we've come with.
Let me guess, that's because we don't do it particularly quickly? Is that there are safeguards in place?
There's some good safeguards in place, listening to the presbyteries, listening to other churches nearby, and that is the rule in the Book of Forms, that one must listen. And one may listen and still decide to sell, and others who see that need to accept that. But the quality of the listening is something that the wider community is looking out at. What does this church care? Do they care about us? Would they be interested in helping with something which may not fit their model, but would actually really serve us as people? And when the wider community hears, and we're going back to that idea of attractional church, they hear the church listening to them, I believe that a missional door opens.
From a presbytery standpoint, however, you can look at the whole region, and just what you were saying, we have churches in rural parts where the population has declined, and it wouldn't be strategically prudent to send a team into a church like that. So is that the kind of thing that you've seen happen in the UK when you were part of the Holy Trinity Brompton church planting movement? Maybe Lakeside did something similar here in Guelph, where you identify a particular neighborhood, particular area, and say, that's somewhere that's growing, where we see potential, but that other is not. How do you do that?
I would say I think we have some great people leading in the diocese, the presbyteries, the denominations in Canada. You don't go through the sacrifice of leading at that level unless you're really passionate about the gospel. Those are hard jobs, and it's pretty amazing in the case of the Presbyterian Church of Canada to see guys like Ian MacDonald and Dale Woods in Montreal, Herb Gale, these guys really investing and doing that thinking with the presbyteries. Hearing from presbyteries in the United Church and the Anglican Church, even hearing from the way that Catholic dioceses are working, the connections between, let's call them mainline denominations, I think are particularly helpful learning environments. So within my role as National Network's catalyst for Church Planting Canada, I've been trying to encourage this national conversation in smaller subgroups like the mainline denominations, as well as more widely bringing newer networks and denominations who maybe have got completely different ways of thinking alongside some real mission-minded people from the established church. I love getting excited about it, but there's no point pretending we're further ahead than we actually are. At this stage, the idea of listening, hearing what models are working, having conversations like we're doing now, and adapting them and trying them, this is the real stage that we're at now. I love the idea of pilot projects, and when you look at the fund that, for instance, you have in this presbytery, it's a great opportunity to try something out. Many of the traditional denominations, and speaking as an Anglican, we like to build policies rather than pilot projects. It's impossible to build a policy for church planting when we've seen so little of it in the mainline denominations in Canada. What we could realistically see are some more pilots, some attempts where we say this might not work, but as I always say in church planting, the only thing we can't screw up is child safety. Everything else we can screw up, and we should probably try screwing up some more and just seeing what happens. I love when planting a church, calling our first set of Sundays Test Sundays. I welcome people and say, welcome, this is our first test Sunday, and if you're here, it means you're part of the test, and we'd love to hear back from you and see what you think about how this Sunday morning has gone. The more I do that, the more I think, why don't we do that every Sunday in every church? It's a great way of helping people feel part of what we're doing, and that those experiments in church planting, I think, give us some huge opportunities.